The camp sat silent as October light faded across the Green River Valley in 1829. 7 trappers clustered around flames, stomachs complaining loudly. Autumn trapping had yielded disappointing results. Beaver were becoming scarce in nearby waterways, and buffalo herds had migrated southward earlier than anticipated. Tomorrow would require breaking camp and pursuing the game animals. Tonight, however, barely sufficient meat existed to feed everyone present. That's when Elijah Crawford made his declaration. He would return with fresh game by sunrise using a hunting method acquired from the Shoshone people. He would hunt during darkness using fire as illumination. The response arrived immediately and dismissively. Absurd. Impossible. Dangerous. Every man surrounding that fire understood you couldn't hunt successfully in darkness. Game animals fled at the first detection of human scent or sound. Ignite a fire near hunting territory, and you'd frighten every creature for miles in all directions. And even if by some miracle you spotted an animal in blackness, how would you aim accurately? How would you see to reload your rifle if the first shot missed? That's an excellent way to burn down half the valley and still starve, said William Bridger, checking his traps by firelight. Or get yourself killed, stumbling around in total darkness. What none of these experienced trappers comprehended was that Crawford had spent the previous winter with a Shoshone band near Jackson's Hole. He'd observed their hunters returning night after night with deer that seemed impossible to procure. He'd learned a technique so counterintuitive that most white trappers dismissed it without genuine consideration. A method that would appear like pure foolishness until you witnessed it working. And when it did work, it would transform everything these men believed they understood about hunting after sunset. The story of how one trapper's supposedly foolish fire trick transformed nighttime hunting in the Rocky Mountains is more than a tale of survival. It's a narrative about the collision of 2 hunting cultures, about experienced men learning to question their fundamental assumptions, and about a technique so effective it would eventually require legal prohibition. But in 1829, in a remote valley where 7 hungry men confronted a harsh winter, it was simply a desperate gamble that would either prove Crawford correct or make him the laughingstock of the brigade. Elijah Crawford had arrived in the Rocky Mountains during spring 1825, answering William Ashley's advertisement for enterprising young men to ascend the Missouri River as fur trappers. He was 22 years old, raised in Ohio, and had worked briefly as a blacksmith before the call of the mountains proved irresistible. Like most of the 3,000 men who would work as mountain men between 1820 and 1840, Crawford started knowing almost nothing about wilderness survival. The first years provided brutal education. He learned to set beaver traps in ice-cold streams, to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to identify animal tracks in snow and mud. He learned which roots were edible and which would leave him doubled over in agony. He learned to sleep with one eye open in territory where Blackfoot war parties moved silently through darkness. He nearly died twice that first winter, once from exposure and once from an infected wound that turned his arm black before a French-Canadian trapper showed him which tree bark to boil for medicine. By 1828, Crawford had become competent enough to survive, but he was far from prospering. Beaver were becoming harder to locate as more trappers flooded into the mountains. Competition from the Hudson's Bay Company was driving down prices at the annual rendezvous. Some seasons he barely broke even after paying for powder, lead, traps, and other necessary supplies. That November, his luck ran out completely. A late blizzard caught him alone in what would later be called Jackson's Hole, and he lost his horse along with most of his gear when the animal broke through ice crossing a frozen creek. For 3 days, he struggled through waist-deep snow with just his rifle, his possibles bag, and the clothes on his back. When the Shoshone hunting party found him, he was building a fire with numb fingers, minutes away from giving up entirely. The Shoshone band that took Crawford in numbered about 40 people, led by a headman named Washakie, who would later become one of the most respected chiefs in the region. They were moving to their winter camp in a protected valley where hot springs kept one meadow clear of snow year-round. Crawford spent 4 months with them, recovering his strength and learning skills that most white trappers never bothered to acquire. It was during this time that Crawford first witnessed jacklighting. The Shoshone called it something different in their language, but the English word that would later emerge was jacklighting, derived from the jack pine knots that burned brightest and longest. The first time Crawford witnessed the technique, he thought he was watching some kind of ceremony. It was late January, and hunting had been poor for weeks. Deep snow made stalking difficult, and game was scarce near the winter camp. That night, as darkness fell, he watched 2 Shoshone hunters prepare for what they called the night hunt. They took an iron trade pan, probably obtained from French trappers years earlier, and mounted it on a pole cut from green willow. The pan was perhaps 8 inches across and 3 inches deep. One hunter carefully selected pieces of pitch-rich pine from a pile they'd been collecting for weeks. These weren't just any pine pieces. They were knots where branches joined the trunk, sections so saturated with resin that they felt heavy in the hand and smelled strongly of pine pitch. The hunter arranged these pine knots in the iron pan, building them up carefully. Then he used a coal from the evening fire to light the pile. The pitch-rich wood caught quickly, burning with a bright, steady flame that illuminated everything within 30 feet. But here was the clever part. The iron pan contained the fire, while the pole allowed the hunter to hold it away from his body. A second pole was lashed crosswise at the base to create a T-shape that could be braced against the hunter's hip or shoulder. Crawford watched as the 2 hunters moved quietly away from camp, one carrying the burning fire pan held high, the other following close behind with his bow ready. The fire cast a moving circle of light as they walked, and Crawford assumed they would scare every animal in the valley. He went to sleep, expecting them to return empty-handed and sheepish. Instead, they returned 3 hours later with a mule deer buck draped across their shoulders. Over the next weeks, Crawford asked questions. The hunters were initially reluctant to explain, but Washakie gave permission, and one of the hunters who spoke some English began to teach him. What Crawford learned contradicted everything he thought he knew about hunting. The technique relied on understanding deer behavior that most white hunters never observed because they only hunted during daylight. Deer, elk, and other game animals are crepuscular, meaning they're most active at dawn and dusk, but they also move and feed throughout the night, especially during winter, when they need to maintain body heat and find food constantly. In winter months, deer often come to streams and creeks at night to drink and feed on water plants and willow shoots along the banks. The key insight was this: deer that had never encountered artificial light at night didn't recognize it as a threat. Their instincts told them to flee from the scent of predators, from sudden movements, from the sounds of pursuit. But a steady, bright light, they had no instinctive response to it. They would stand and stare, mesmerized, their eyes reflecting the light back in bright green or orange gleams. The Shoshone hunter explained the critical details. You had to move slowly, very slowly, keeping the light steady. Quick movements would break the spell. You worked near water where deer came to drink. You kept the wind in your face so your scent didn't reach them. You listen carefully for the sounds of animals moving, the crack of a twig, the splash of hooves in shallow water. When you caught the eyeshine reflecting back, you froze. You brought your weapon to bear with excruciatingly slow movements, and you aimed for the shadow between the two glowing eyes. The iron pan was essential because it served multiple purposes. It contained the fire safely, keeping embers from falling and starting a brush fire. The metal heated up and helped the pine knots burn more efficiently. And crucially, it could be tilted to direct the light where you needed it without casting confusing shadows. The pine knots themselves were carefully selected. Jack pine, pitch pine, or yellow pine all worked, but the knots had to be old, from dead wood, where the resin had concentrated over years. Fresh pine wouldn't work. It smoked too much and didn't burn bright enough. But those old knots, blackened and hard with crystallized pitch, they burned like torches. A handful of good knots could keep a bright flame going for an hour or more. Crawford practiced with unloaded weapons first, learning to move with the peculiar shuffle step that kept the fire pan steady. He learned to read the terrain in firelight, avoiding rocks and holes that could turn an ankle. He learned to judge distances in the circle of illumination, understanding that things looked closer than they were when you were holding the light source. When the Shoshone finally let him try a real hunt, Crawford felt like he was doing everything wrong. Every instinct screamed that he was being too obvious, too loud, too visible, but he followed the technique exactly as taught, moving slowly along a creek bed, with the fire pan held high. 20 minutes into the hunt, he saw it. 2 green points of light reflecting back, from across the creek, perhaps 40 feet away. He froze. The eyes didn't move. Slowly, with infinite care, he brought his rifle up. The heavy flintlock was a problem. He had to hold the fire pan in his left hand while aiming with his right, in an awkward position, but he managed it, sighting between those 2 glowing points. The rifle's crack shattered the night silence. The eyes disappeared. Crawford's heart sank, certain he'd missed. But when he crossed the creek and searched with the fire pan, he found the deer crumpled in the brush, dead from a shot through the neck. He'd been aiming for the head, but the awkward position had pulled his shot low. It didn't matter. Fresh meat was fresh meat. That hunt changed something in Crawford. He'd been shown a technique that worked, that actually worked, despite violating every rule he'd learned about hunting. When he left the Shoshone camp in early spring with new gear they'd helped him make, he carried with him an iron pan and a supply of carefully selected pine knots. He also carried knowledge that few white trappers possessed. Back around the fire in October 1829, Crawford's proposal to try jacklighting met with the skepticism of men who trusted only what they'd learned through hard experience. These weren't stupid men. They were survivors in an environment that killed the careless and the foolish with casual efficiency. They'd seen men die from eating the wrong roots, from drinking bad water, from underestimating distances in mountain country where clear air made things look closer than they were. They'd lost companions to grizzly bears, to rock slides, to winter storms that struck without warning. So when Crawford proposed hunting at night with fire, they heard it as another greenhorn idea that would get a man killed. The Shoshone do it, Crawford said quietly. Saw them bring in meat all winter when daylight hunting was impossible. The Shoshone also eat raw fish and grasshoppers, countered Bridger. Doesn't mean we should. But there was one man who didn't immediately dismiss the idea. Jacob Weatherby had been trapping in the mountains since 1822. He'd been with Ashley on the Missouri River during the Arikara fight in 1823. He'd crossed South Pass with Jedediah Smith and seen the Great Salt Lake before most Americans knew it existed. At 37, he was old by mountain man standards, and he'd learned that survival sometimes meant trying things that seemed wrong. Let him try, Weatherby said. Worst that happens. He wastes the night and we're still hungry tomorrow. Best that happens, we eat venison for breakfast. Best that happens. Another trapper laughed. Jacob, the best that happens is we find his bones in the spring after he falls in the river, or shoots himself trying to load in the dark. But Weatherby's word carried weight, and Crawford was free to make a fool of himself if he chose. Crawford spent the remaining daylight preparing. He had an iron skillet from his cooking gear. Deeper than ideal, but it would serve. He needed a long pole, something green that wouldn't burn. He found a straight willow branch near the creek, about 6 feet long and as thick as his thumb. He lashed the skillet to one end using strips of rawhide, positioning it so the handle stuck out to one side where he could grip it to angle the pan. The pine knots were easier. The valley had scattered dead pines, killed by some long-ago fire, and their trunks were studded with knots that had concentrated pitch for decades. Crawford collected a leather bag full, choosing pieces that felt heavy and oily to the touch. These would burn bright and long. As darkness fell, the other trappers watched with barely concealed amusement as Crawford built his fire pan. He arranged the pine knots carefully, leaving space for air to circulate. Using a coal from the campfire, he lit the pile and watched as flames licked up, quickly catching hold. The knots burned with surprising brightness, casting long shadows across the camp. Well, you got yourself a nice torch, Bridger observed. Now what? Now I go hunting, Crawford said. He'd already loaded his rifle, a process he could do by feel after 5 years in the mountains. The flintlock was a plain-style rifle, shorter and heavier than the Kentucky rifles some trappers preferred, with a bore large enough to take down elk. He carried his powder horn and bullet pouch, plus a supply of pine knots wrapped in leather to keep them dry. The fire pan he balanced on his shoulder, the pole braced against his body. Walking with the fire pan was awkward at first. The weight wasn't evenly distributed, and the flames danced and guttered with each step. But Crawford fell into the rhythm he'd learned from the Shoshone, a slow, steady shuffle that kept the fire burning bright and level. Behind him, he heard one of the trappers call out something mocking, but the words didn't register. He was already focusing on the hunt. Crawford headed downstream away from camp, following the creek into a wider valley. The fire pan cast a circle of light perhaps 30 feet across, showing the ground immediately around him, but making everything beyond the circle seem darker by contrast. The night sounds were loud in his ears, the creek burbling over stones, an owl calling from the timber, the hiss and crackle of burning pine pitch. He moved slowly, stopping every few steps to listen and watch. His breath steamed in the cold air. The fire pan warmed his left side while his right stayed cold. His eyes adapted to the strange illumination, learning again to judge distances and read terrain. 20 minutes passed. 30? Crawford began to wonder if the deer had moved to different feeding grounds. The technique required patience, more patience than most men possessed. You couldn't rush it. You had to move like you had all night, because you did. Then he saw them. 3 points of light reflecting back from the darkness near the creek bank. Then 2 more further back. Eyeshine. Deer. Crawford froze mid-step, his foot still raised. Slowly, with infinite care, he lowered his foot to the ground. The eyes didn't move. They stared at the light, unblinking, mesmerized. Crawford could make out the shadowy shapes of their bodies now. 2 deer at the water's edge, perhaps 45 feet away. He needed to get closer. Too far for an accurate shot in this light. He took 1 slow step forward. Another. The deer remained frozen, staring at the bright flame. Another step, another. The sound of the creek helped cover the small noises he made. 35 feet now. Now 30. Crawford shifted the fire pan slightly, trying to illuminate the deer better without making sudden movements. There, the closest deer was a doe, but behind her was a larger shape. A buck, probably. That was the shot he wanted. The problem was the rifle. He needed both hands free to aim properly, but the fire pan required one hand to hold steady. The Shoshone used bows, which could be managed with the fire pan braced against the body. A heavy flintlock rifle was different. Crawford slowly brought the rifle up with his right hand while balancing the fire pan pole on his left shoulder. It was an awkward position, nearly impossible to hold steady. The rifle wavered, but at 30 feet, with the buck standing motionless, he didn't need perfection. He just needed to hit the chest cavity. He found the two eye shines in his sight picture, aimed low between them where the chest should be. His finger found the trigger. He took a breath, let half of it out, held. The flintlock roared. The flash from the pan momentarily blinded him, but he heard the solid thump of the ball striking flesh. The eye shines vanished, crashing sounds in the brush as the deer fled. Crawford stood still, waiting for his night vision to return. The pine knots in his fire pan burned on, unconcerned with the violence that had just occurred. When he could see again, he walked slowly to where the deer had been standing. Blood, dark spots on the sandy creek bank, black in the firelight. A blood trail leading into the brush. Crawford followed it. The fire pan held high. 20 feet into the brush, he found the buck dead, with a bullet hole just behind the front shoulder. A perfect lung shot. The buck would have run a few yards and collapsed as its lungs filled with blood. Crawford stood there for a moment, looking down at the dead animal, feeling the weight of what he'd just proven. This worked. This actually worked. Not by luck or chance, but because the technique was sound. Getting the buck back to camp was harder than the hunt had been. He couldn't carry both the deer and the fire pan. He reluctantly extinguished the fire in the creek, then hoisted the buck across his shoulders and began the slow walk back. The deer probably weighed 120 pounds, and the walk took him nearly an hour, stopping frequently to rest. When Crawford finally stumbled into camp, it was nearly midnight. The fire had burned low, and most of the men were sleeping. But Bridger was still up, keeping watch, and he stood quickly when Crawford emerged from the darkness with the buck across his shoulders. "Well, I'll be damned," Bridger said loudly enough to wake the others. He actually did it. The camp came alive. Men stumbled out of their bedrolls to examine the deer. They inspected the bullet hole, right behind the shoulder. A clean kill. The liver and heart were intact. Good eating. This was real meat, enough to feed all 7 of them for days. "How?" Weatherby asked simply. Crawford told them, describing the technique in detail. The fire pan, the pine knots, the eye shine, the slow approach, the shot. Some of the men were skeptical, even with evidence lying at their feet. "Maybe you just got lucky," one suggested. "Stumbled on a stupid deer." "Then I'll get lucky again tomorrow night," Crawford said. "And the night after that?" Over the next week, Crawford proved it wasn't luck. 3 more nights produced 3 more deer. The technique worked consistently if you possessed patience and followed the rules. The other trappers couldn't deny the evidence, and their skepticism transformed into fascination. Weatherby was the first to attempt it himself. Crawford showed him how to prepare the fire pan, how to select the right pine knots, how to move, and where to look for eye shine. Weatherby's first attempt was unsuccessful. He moved too quickly and spooked a deer before getting close enough for a shot. But his second night, he brought back a young bull elk. Once Weatherby succeeded, the others wanted to learn. Crawford found himself teaching the technique night after night, explaining the details he'd learned from the Shoshone. How to angle the pan to avoid casting your own shadow. How to use the wind to carry your scent away from the game. How to judge distance in firelight, which made everything look slightly closer than it was. How to move when a deer was watching, freezing in place for minutes at a time if necessary. Not everyone could master it. The technique required patience that some men simply didn't possess. It required comfort with being alone in the dark, moving slowly while your mind screamed at you to hurry. It required the ability to stay calm when you saw eye shine staring back at you, remembering that not all glowing eyes belong to deer. Mountain lions, wolves, and bears also had eye shine, and learning to distinguish between species was critical. One trapper, a man named Peters, panicked when he encountered a bear during a jacklighting attempt. The bear was just as surprised as Peters and ran off, but Peters dropped his fire pan in his haste to retreat, starting a small brush fire that took hours to put out. After that incident, the brigade established rules. No jacklighting during dry conditions. Always have water nearby. Keep the fire pan under control. But for those who could master the technique, the advantages were obvious. Winter hunting had always been difficult. Deep snow made stalking nearly impossible. Game was scarce near camps because hunting pressure had driven them away. Daylight hunting often meant long expeditions into backcountry, days away from your trap lines. Jacklighting changed the calculation entirely. You could hunt near camp along the creeks and streams where deer came to drink at night. You could bring in meat in a few hours instead of a few days. You could hunt during the dark winter months when daylight was scarce. And perhaps most importantly, you could hunt when other predators were sleeping, reducing the competition and the danger. The technique spread through the trapping community faster than Crawford expected. At the 1830 rendezvous on the Wind River held in July, Crawford found himself surrounded by trappers wanting to know about that fire hunting trick. Men from other brigades, other companies, had heard stories. Some dismissed them as tall tales. Others wanted to learn. Crawford and Weatherby demonstrated the technique, showing how to build the fire pan and select good pine knots. They explained the principles, the patience required, the way eye shine appeared in firelight. Some men immediately understood the value. Others remained skeptical, preferring daylight hunting methods they already knew. But word continued to spread. The technique was too effective, too valuable for hunters to ignore. By 1832, jacklighting had become common practice among mountain men throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Some trappers developed improvements on Crawford's original method. They experimented with different materials for the fire pan, finding that shallow pans worked better than deep skillets. They tried different types of wood, discovering that old pine knots were indeed best, but that pitch from pine stumps could be collected and burned in small containers for the same effect. Some hunters started using birch bark, which burned bright and clean, layered with pine pitch for longer burning. Others found that animal fat, bear grease specifically, could be burned in iron pans to create steady light, though it smoked more than wood and had a smell that sometimes spooked game. The native peoples, who had been using jacklighting for generations, watched these developments with mixed feelings. Some were pleased that white trappers finally understood a technique they'd known for centuries. Others recognized that more efficient hunting meant more pressure on game populations that were already declining from overhunting. And those game populations were declining. The mountain men were harvesting large amounts of meat, not just for themselves, but to trade at the summer rendezvous and to supply the growing number of immigrants traveling west. Jacklighting made hunting so efficient that even mediocre hunters could bring in meat consistently. The deer and elk populations around popular camping areas began to show the strain. By the mid-1830s, some trappers were noticing the problem. Weatherby, who had been in the mountains longer than most, commented that areas where he'd seen dozens of deer in the late 1820s now showed only scattered animals. The connection to jacklighting wasn't immediately obvious. Hunting pressure in general was increasing. But some started to wonder if the technique was too effective for the animal's own good. Crawford himself became uncomfortable with what he'd helped create. He'd learned the technique as a survival skill, a way to feed himself and his companions during hard times. But now he saw trappers jacklighting for sport, or taking more game than they needed, wasting meat because it was so easy to get more. This wasn't what the Shoshone had taught him. They had used the technique carefully, respectfully, taking only what they needed. In 1835, Crawford was back in Shoshone territory, trading for horses. He encountered Washakie, the headman who had taken him in during that desperate winter. Through a translator, Washakie asked Crawford about the fire hunting he'd been teaching white men. "The deer are fewer now," Washakie said. "Your people hunt them at night, every night. The deer have no rest." Crawford couldn't deny it. He'd noticed the same thing. But he also knew he couldn't unteach what he'd spread. The technique was too valuable, too effective. It had become part of mountain man culture. "We need rules," Crawford said. "Limits on when and where to hunt with fire." Washakie nodded slowly. "Your people don't follow rules in the mountains. Each man does as he wants." It was true. The mountain men prided themselves on their independence, their freedom from the laws and restrictions of settled society. Trying to impose hunting regulations on them would be nearly impossible. But the problem solved itself in an unexpected way. By 1840, the fur trade was collapsing. Beaver hats had gone out of fashion in Europe, replaced by silk hats that required no fur at all. The price of beaver pelts plummeted. The great rendezvous ended. Mountain men scattered, some becoming guides for immigrant wagons, others settling in the valleys they'd once trapped. The period of the mountain man was over, and with it went many of the practices that had defined their way of life. Jacklighting continued, but in different hands. Settlers moving into the region adopted the technique, using it to feed their families during hard winters. Some used it legally, hunting on their own land. Others used it for poaching, taking deer illegally from public lands or private property. As territorial governments formed and game laws were established, jacklighting increasingly came under legal scrutiny. Wildlife officials recognized that the technique was too effective, giving hunters an unfair advantage and putting unsustainable pressure on deer populations. State by state, territory by territory, laws were passed restricting or banning night hunting with artificial light. By the time Theodore Roosevelt wrote about his jacklighting experience in the Adirondacks in the 1870s, the practice was already illegal in many places. Roosevelt, who would later help found the Boone and Crockett Club, dedicated to ethical hunting, wrote that while he'd enjoyed the experience as a boy, he would never do it again. The technique was simply too effective to be sporting, too damaging to wildlife populations to be sustainable. Today, jacklighting is illegal in most jurisdictions, banned under laws that prohibit hunting with artificial light. Wildlife management has recognized what the Shoshone and other native peoples always knew: hunting must be balanced with conservation. Taking must be matched with allowing populations to recover. The technique that Crawford learned and spread was effective precisely because it gave humans an overwhelming advantage over animals that had no evolutionary defense against artificial light at night. Crawford himself never saw the full effects of what he'd helped create. He died in 1842, killed not in some dramatic mountain confrontation, but from a simple infection after cutting his hand while butchering an elk. He was 39 years old. The hand became red and swollen, then the arm. Then he developed a fever that burned him up over 3 days. He died in a cabin near Fort Laramie, tended by friends who could do nothing but watch as the infection spread. Before he died, delirious with fever, Crawford talked about his time with the Shoshone. He talked about that first winter when they'd saved his life and taught him to hunt at night. He talked about Washakie and the other hunters who'd shared their knowledge. In his final hours, he seemed to be back in that winter camp, watching the fire pan being lit, seeing the eye shine in the darkness. "Worked too well," he muttered at one point when the fever briefly cleared. "Should have kept it secret." But knowledge once shared cannot be taken back. The technique Crawford learned and taught spread throughout the frontier, adapted and modified by hundreds of hunters. For a brief period in the 1830s, it was a prized skill among mountain men, a way to survive hard times and feed your companions when other methods failed. Later, it became a tool of commercial hunting and poaching, used to harvest game for market sale. Eventually, it was recognized as unsustainable and banned. The story of jacklighting is the story of the American frontier in miniature. A technique developed by native peoples through generations of careful observation, shared with a white trapper who was desperate enough to learn. That knowledge spread rapidly through a community of men who valued practical skills above tradition. The technique proved so effective that it was overused, putting pressure on wildlife populations. Eventually, as wild areas became settled and game laws were established, the technique was restricted and then banned. What remains is the historical record. The journals of mountain men occasionally mention night hunting, though most are frustratingly vague about details. Archaeological evidence shows iron pans and fire-hardened wooden poles at sites associated with trappers' camps. Native American oral histories record the teaching of fire hunting techniques to white trappers, and the laws themselves, prohibiting hunting with artificial light, stand as evidence that the technique was once common enough to require regulation. The technique itself is simple enough that it could be reconstructed from these historical accounts. An iron pan, pine knots rich with pitch, a pole to hold the pan, patience to move slowly and wait for eye shine, knowledge of where deer come to water, understanding of wind direction and animal behavior. All the elements are there in the historical record, waiting for anyone curious enough to piece them together. But the context that made jacklighting necessary and then problematic cannot be reconstructed. The vast wilderness of the 1830s is gone. The abundant game populations that could sustain occasional fire hunting no longer exist. The legal and ethical frameworks around hunting have evolved, recognizing that wildlife belongs to everyone and must be managed for sustainability. Crawford's foolish fire trick was neither foolish nor his own invention. It was an adaptation of ancient hunting wisdom, shared by people who understood that knowledge should serve survival. For a brief moment in the 1830s, it was a valuable skill that helped trappers endure harsh mountain winters. Its effectiveness was both its strength and its weakness. It worked so well that it became unsustainable, requiring legal prohibition to protect the very game animals that hunters depended on. The lesson, perhaps, is that the best techniques are often those that seem most counterintuitive. The idea that you could hunt successfully at night using fire to illuminate your prey violated every instinct that experienced hunters trusted. But it worked because it exploited a gap in animal behavior, a response to light that evolution hadn't prepared deer to handle. The deeper lesson is about balance. The Shoshone used jacklighting sparingly, taking what they needed when other hunting methods failed. They understood that abundance today didn't guarantee abundance tomorrow. They hunted with respect, aware that they were taking life to sustain life. When mountain men adopted the technique, many lost that sense of balance, using it as often as convenient rather than as needed. By the time Crawford died in 1842, jacklighting was already becoming controversial. Some hunters defended it as a legitimate survival technique. Others condemned it as unsporting and wasteful. The debate would continue for decades, eventually resolved by legal prohibition rather than social consensus. Today, the technique exists primarily in the historical record and in the folklore of hunting culture. Older hunters in rural areas sometimes tell stories of grandfathers or great-grandfathers who fire hunted legally before the bans took effect. Wildlife officers tell cautionary tales of poachers caught using spotlights, the modern equivalent of Crawford's fire pan. Historians debate the impact of mountain man-hunting practices on 19th century game populations. What's undeniable is that for a brief period, one trapper's willingness to learn from the native people and share that knowledge transformed hunting practices across the Rocky Mountain region. The technique spread not because Crawford promoted it, but because it worked. In the harsh world of the mountain men, effectiveness was the only standard that mattered. A method that put meat in the pot reliably was a method worth learning, regardless of where it came from or how strange it seemed. The irony is that Crawford's most lasting legacy wasn't his years as a trapper. It wasn't the beaver pelts he harvested or the trails he explored. It was a hunting technique he learned during one desperate winter, taught to a few companions around a fire, which then spread through the trapping community and eventually required laws to control. He would have been puzzled by that outcome, maybe troubled by it. But in 1829, standing beside that campfire, with a dead deer at his feet, and his companions staring in disbelief, Crawford wasn't thinking about long-term consequences. He was thinking about hot venison steaks cooking over the coals, about full bellies for the first time in days, about having proven that sometimes the foolish-sounding idea is the one that works. That moment of vindication, of showing skeptical men that fire hunting was real and effective, that was enough. The rest of the story would unfold without him, written by hundreds of hunters who learned the technique and adapted it to their own needs. The fire trick that seemed so foolish became standard practice, then became controversial, then became illegal. But for one cold night in October 1829, it was simply the solution to a problem that experienced trappers thought had no solution. That's what Crawford brought back from his winter with the Shoshone. Not just a hunting technique, but the understanding that solutions sometimes come from unexpected places, from people whose knowledge you might otherwise dismiss, from methods that seem to violate everything you think you know. That understanding, more than the technique itself, is Crawford's real legacy. The willingness to learn from those who know different things, the courage to try what seems impossible, the humility to admit that your way might not be the only way, or even the best way. Those lessons transcend hunting, transcend the mountain man era, transcend the specific historical moment when one trapper decided to light a fire and walk into the darkness looking for eyeshine. In the end, that's what makes this story worth telling. Not because jacklighting was a great innovation, it was simply the adaptation of existing knowledge. Not because Crawford was a hero, he was just a trapper trying to survive, but because it demonstrates how knowledge moves between cultures, how desperate circumstances force people to question their assumptions, and how effective techniques can become victims of their own success. The fire trick worked. That was the problem. It worked too well. And there lies a cautionary tale about the relationship between humans and the natural world, about the need for restraint even when abundance seems infinite, about the value of traditional ecological knowledge that modern practice too often ignores. Crawford couldn't have foreseen any of that. He was just trying to bring back meat for hungry men. But the ripples from that decision, from that willingness to try something foolish, spread far beyond one campfire in 1829.